All right, everyone. I want to thank you very much for joining us here this evening. My name is Peter Buck. I am the Democratic candidate for the 171st Legislative District here in Central Pennsylvania. And I want to welcome you to our discussion tonight on race in America. This is the fourth conversation that we've had on issues of concern to people in Central Pennsylvania. Previous issues have included COVID-19, rural broadband, and climate change. But I have to say that tonight's issue feels really, really weighty in a way that maybe those others have not. Like many of you, I've spent a lot of the last 2 weeks since I watched the murder, the lynching of George Floyd in a state of sadness, outrage, shock, disbelief, total belief, and a bit of despair, but also hope and conviction for the people in our community who are taking action. And I do want to say that my deepest condolences go to the family and the friends of Mr. Floyd, and also to the families of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Jean, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Joe Castile, Sandra Bland, Jordan Davis, Osagie Osagi, and too many people to name. And as a future legislator, I know that mere condolences do not cut it. A couple of things that are personal for me that got me here, because I really want to make sure that we tell stories and that we hear the stories from our panelists, is that one of my best friends in high school, her father was killed by the Ku Klux Klan in Greensboro, North Carolina. And the trauma that was visited upon her stayed with her for her life, and also made her and her family into real soldiers to make sure that people's civil rights are guaranteed. I also have a son, and he's 13, and he loves to play basketball, and just about every day he goes over to the park and he can wear a hoodie, his Golden State Warriors hoodie, and he is never at risk of being killed by a police officer. I never worry that the hug that I give my son is going to be the last hug that I ever give him. And I believe that we need to live in a nation where every mother and father doesn't have to worry that their hug for their son for going outside to play basketball could be their last hug. I'm not sure all the time what exactly we're going to do, but I know that we need to listen, that we need to understand, and we need to work together toward action, which is why I've asked the four people who I have here today to speak with us, share stories, help us understand, and build the will to take action together. Reverend Carol Thomas Cissel holds an MS in Divinity and is the settled minister of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Center County and State College. She is passionate about homiletics, crafting exuberant worship, which I experience, travel, and small batch bourbon. Carol collects the masterworks of Native American and First Nations people, contemporary art glass, and kisses from her delicious grandson, Andrew. Kyra is a 17-year-old student activist from State College. Her protest background began in her freshman year of high school when she attended a protest against Donald Trump's inauguration, and it has progressed until she helped organize the local March for Our Lives and other movements throughout her presidency of the Diversity and Activism Club at State High. Now, a rising college sophomore, she has spent her freshman year of college at Spelman University in Atlanta, Georgia, the #1 HBCU in the country, which she will not let you forget. Miranda Marks is a 15-year-old rising sophomore in the State College Delta program. She is a committed youth activist. She is a strong peer and advocate for civil rights in her school. And she is also one of our region's wonderful climate change activists. Finally, Josh Inwood is an associate professor of geography and a senior research associate with the Rock Ethics Institute at Penn State. And his work examines the role of race and racism in American society and how communities respond to radicalized violence through grassroots justice initiatives. Thank you all for being here with me. So I'm hoping that Reverend Carroll will begin us with some words.
Words. Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate you for who you are and for including me this evening. So words, I have a quote that I want to share with you, and then I also have a prayer. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and my right to exist. That's by Robert Jones, Jr. And a prayer. Remind us that our struggles for liberation are connected. Source of sources remind us that our ancestors are actually one. Remember George Floyd. Remember Breonna Taylor. Remember the others who have passed. Remind us that the Black and brown protesters lifting their voices are one. May we all remember this evening. May we all think together about how linked we are, about how the fight belongs to all of us, and that justice and freedom belongs to no one individual. May it be so.
May it be so.
May it be so.
So, Reverend Carroll, as our elder, if I may say.
Well, thank you so much.
I wonder where you think we ought to begin.
That's such a big question. I think we have to begin by all just taking a breath in and letting that breath out, and realizing that it took a long time for us to get here, and it may take a little bit of time for us to change things. I also think there's some basics here. We need to be relentlessly honest with each other. If we don't tell the truth, we don't develop trust. If we don't develop trust, we cannot build relationships. And if we are not in relationship, we can't change systems or even begin to change the world. So I do think that's where we have to start with some fundamentals: trust, relationships, and telling the truth as often and everywhere that we can.
So what is a truth? What is one of your truths that you think that we need to understand?
One of my truths is that I came to this place from a place that was disposable. So when I'm speaking to you all, or I'm speaking to my people on Sunday morning, what I always remember is my ancestors came here. When they put their feet on the soil, they were already disposable. When the Constitution was written, it was not for them. When the Declaration of Independence came into being, it did not make them independent. So part of my story, part of my truth, is I come from a place in a country that said I was disposable from day one. If we're going to change the way the systems are, part of the truth has to deal with that idea that people of color are disposable. And it has to go back to the great sin of slavery. So that's a fundamental truth.
And then, I mean, that's a lot of history packed into, just a minute. What has that meant for you in your personal life or your professional life? Or
professionally, truth-wise, I walk into spaces and I let people know that I know who I am and that I belong. So part of the truth too has to be that the space is for me. It's not exclusively yours. It's not a white space because there's more white people there. And that happens a lot in State College. I walk into rooms all the time where I'm the only. So being the only Black person, being the only woman over 50, being the only Black minister means that there's a piece of my truth that has to be, I belong here, just as much as everybody else that's in the room.
Kyra, I want to turn to you, because yesterday when we were talking, I think you were saying very, very much some of the stuff that Reverend Carroll just said about truth, and you said when I said, what do you want to be asked? You said, oh, well, there's all kinds of things you could ask me. So, Reverend Carroll just gave us a truth. What is a truth for you?
Mm-hmm. So I think my truth is a very similar experience, just from a different perspective. So for me, that I think the core truth is the disposability that Reverend Cissel mentioned, right? And I think that manifests in every Black person's life differently. For me, from a very young age, it meant being an other in a country where being the other is viewed as dangerous, and that translates into most everything. It means, from classroom to professional career, she mentioned it, we are the only, we are one of few, if any other. And for me, it meant growing up with experiences that I thought were normal, that when I talk to people with privilege, particularly white people, I realized aren't normal. So it's not normal to have to tell people, no, you can't pet me like an animal. It's not normal to have to tell people, yes, we have to talk about my history in class. It's not normal to be followed around a store from a young age simply because of the color of my skin. It's not normal for people to ask me, no, where am I really from? And it's not normal for people to tell me to go back to Africa, a place that I cannot even trace my history to due to the nature of chattel slavery. And so I'm 17, I'm young, but I have been forced to mature in a number of ways due to my otherness. I didn't get a chance at a full ignorant youth, and that's my truth. Now, did I choose to accelerate this through my activism? Yes, because I knew that there has to be people who can put themselves on the line and speak up, so that the people that are weary, have put in their time, simply cannot bear to explain over and over again every day, out of every month, out of every year, why their very existence matters and is worthy of empathy. So that's my truth.
Really quickly, I called one of my former interns, Janelle, and I talked with my intern Nyla last week. And when I talked to both of them, and they're both young Black women, and I said, hey, how are you? And they both said, I'm tired.
Oh,
yes. They said, I'm tired. I just think it's, it's for the reasons that you're talking about, but then it's been so heightened over the last couple of weeks.
So it's exhausting on a good day in State College to walk around brown. Since what's happened in the last couple of weeks and the replaying of the incident, it's beyond exhausting. So everybody says, I'm tired. Mm-hmm. How are you holding up? I hear that a lot too. What I'm hoping people hear tonight is it's magnified for people of color. So I'm not tired like I need to go take a nap. I'm tired because I walk around holding the burden of racism, mm-hmm. even on days when I don't want to. I don't get a choice in the matter. I don't get a break from racism. So I want to say that about the being tired piece. It's not about needing to rest or to lay down. It's about the idea that the very steps you take, the air you breathe, the place you are in day after day is a burden that you carry, and that's exhausting. But I don't want to talk too much, but I want to hear stories, and I know that's important to you. Mm-hmm. So I want to share a story, okay, because I'm new to State College. I'm going to share a quick story, and I hope there's some humor in it, but I think it shows a piece of what State College is. Mm. So I got here in August of 2017, Big Ten football. I'm very excited. Even though I'm a Maryland Terp fan, I was very excited. Penn State, 100,000 people, 8 Saturdays of fall. I was totally in for it. One of the Saturdays, I think it was in October of 2017, I decided I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna look at it. So I go downtown. I can't find a place to park. So I end up on the street by the library, and I get out and I'm walking through State College. And all I see is white. I see white shirts, I see white pants. I actually see people in white sweatshirts who are white people, and I don't understand. And I go into Target, and there's a kid there in a Penn State sweatshirt, but it's a white sweatshirt, and he actually had the hood up on it. And then I'm really like, what is happening here? And I went further down towards College Avenue, and I popped into one of the joints there, and I finally met a friendly bartender who's like, are you all right? And I said, so what is this with all the white? I just saw a group of like angels. They had on white choir robes that were walking down College Avenue. He was like, oh, it's the white out. I said, excuse me? He said, no, it's the white out. Like we do that, you know, like football, the white out. And I had no idea what he was saying. And I didn't know how to take it. I didn't know how to process it. I went home, I told some friends, and they were like, so you need to move. You can walk around in State College with white hoods on. Like there's 100,000 people all dressed in white. And then I went online and I did my research, guys, and I found out, oh, it's a thing. Like everybody in the stadium's wearing white. And actually at University of Maryland, they have the red out. Everybody wears red. But the idea that actually happens and you don't have any idea why it's okay, I think it speaks to the place that we live. You couldn't have a whiteout in College Park, Maryland. People wouldn't stand for it. Right. But that's like every day here. Like it's normal that takes place. So that's kind of my story. It's like stranger in a strange land. And being the only one who's kind of upset about this idea. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting as someone who has grown up here, you know, and has just grown up around Penn State football. You know, that has become more and more of a thing. And I mean, I'm not a diehard fan, so I find it in my own way confusing. No offense to the Penn State fans, but that's it. That's an interesting story. Now, I wonder, you know, Josh, you know, when you hear, you know, these kinds of stories, they're not isolated, you know. So, I mean, these are part of a pattern that is, as Reverend Carroll said, is 400 years old. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the pattern that is today, but that we got here through whole systems, historical systems, and that's a dissertation, but can you distill that into 5 minutes?
You know, I can try. You know, since you brought up Greensboro, maybe we'll start there. So I do work on reconciliation work in communities across the United States. And, you know, a lot of people probably don't know this, but the United States in certain communities, in around a dozen, maybe 16 communities, they're involved in truth and reconciliation processes in which communities have some kind of history or legacy or contemporary reality of trauma, and groups of citizens are coming together to try to deal with that trauma. And so one of the first ones was in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they were struggling to deal with the aftermath of what's known as the Greensboro Massacre. And so on November 3rd, 1979, a group of labor activists were trying to organize cotton mills, and they had an anti-Ku Klux Klan rally. Long story short, the Ku Klux Klan is obviously a racist organization, but if you know anything about labor organizing in the South, it's also an anti-labor organization. And so as they were getting ready to host this rally, they were with their families, they were with their kids, they were setting up a sound truck. The Ku Klux Klan showed up. They ambushed the labor organizers. 5 people were killed, 10 others were wounded. It was all videotaped by local news crews. Long story short, the Klan was found not guilty in 2 criminal trials for these murders. And you could clearly see who was shooting and what was going on. And so in part of that work, I got to know some of the activists who were involved. And the thing that's always struck with me, and in fact, hearing Reverend Carroll and also hearing Kyra now talk, is that they talked about what they were trying to do was to right unrightable wrongs. And so when we think about the legacy and history of slavery, a legacy and history that we've never really dealt with in this country, we don't really necessarily talk about it. We certainly don't talk about its contemporary reverberations. When we talk about police violence in this community, in this county, in this state, in this nation, what Kyra is doing in leading these protests and in helping to organize those protests is to try to figure out how to right those unrightable wrongs in as best we can. And so, it's really interesting to be in this moment in this nation where you have tens of thousands of people braving tear gas, braving rubber bullets in some instances, certainly braving institutional racism, and stepping forward and saying, we as a nation have this history and we have this reality of racism, of white supremacy, of legacies of slavery, of legacies of genocide. And for too long, we have swept this under the rug. And for too long, we have ignored the realities of that. And it's time for us to start to have a national conversation. And, a big part of that conversation, and I give you a lot of credit, Peter, is opening up forums for people to listen to other people's stories. And part of that is what happened in Greensboro when they took testimony from survivors, when they took testimony from people who were in the Klan and who committed murder, was they opened up a venue for people to talk and listen. And it was uncomfortable, and it was at times emotionally charged, and it was, a process of being heard. And so really, it's nice to be here and to hear these stories, particularly from Reverend Carroll, particularly from Kyra. I know Miranda's going to add so much too, about what it's like to live in Center County, what it's like to live in the 171st state representative district, and the ways we can think about how might we move forward as a community, and how might we hear the pain that exists here in ways that we can start to address this and become a better community.
No, that's really helpful. And yeah, Miranda, you were part of a class that I think is really quite marvelous. It's very inspiring to me. Can you talk about the class that you took at the Delta program, and then kind of how you followed from taking that class into what it is that you're trying to do with your peers and I think adults. I mean, you're here doing this with adults now. So.
Yeah, so the class that I was part of at the Delta program was called Bridging Divides. And it started hundreds of years ago and basically walked through what it means to be Black in America. And we obviously ended off at talking about mass incarceration, talking about institutionalized racism, talking about police brutality. And in October of this year, through that class, I went on a week-long civil rights tour of Alabama. And that was, I think, the most impactful week of my entire life. I don't think I've ever learned so much or changed so much as a human being in such a short amount of time. And, what I took from that, I took so much from that. But the first thing I took from it was the fact that as a white person in an incredibly privileged town, in an incredibly sheltered community where we cover up our racism, where we gloss over it, I have an obligation to educate myself, to engage in conversations just like these conversations right now, to educate others, and to take action, to become an ally. I came back from that trip and immediately started reading. I read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I watched 13th. I watched When They See Us. I watched so much by Ava DuVernay. And I just tried to learn and absorb everything I could. And I think that that's something that is a really prevalent issue now, is that white people are looking to Black people to educate them, to undo their oppression, to explain their oppression, and to, undo their ignorance. And as white people, we have an obligation to educate ourselves. We have an obligation to read, to learn, and to look at what this country is. And so, I wish for everyone the experience to have that trip and to read what I've read and see what I've seen. And I hope that everyone takes those steps, especially white people. We have the obligation to. And Yeah.
You just listed a bunch of sources, and I know they flew by many of the people who are tuned in. I want everyone at home to know that my campaign volunteers are putting together and have put together a lot of resources, and so when if you registered for this, we will be sharing that back out with you all, and we'll also share that through my website, because I want to make sure that we can go from being bystanders to being allies. And I think this is something that Miranda just alluded to. And I know Kyra can explain this really, really well. So would you explain?
Sure, no problem. So he hyped up this explanation that I will do my best. So essentially, what we're looking at here is the reality of this country, and particularly of Central Pennsylvania, it's the systematic racism and oppression and white silence. Mm-hmm. And so everybody has a role around this, whether they are aware of it or not. And so the way I broke it up is, a lot of people want to talk about allyship, but a lot of us aren't even there yet. So you start, white people, because again, Black people, we are born into this. White people, you start as a bystander. You observe the same things we observe, but you see them differently. You don't get their nuances. You more often than not choose not to speak up or step into these situations. So when you can sit comfortably and just observe everything that goes on right under your nose, you're a bystander. And, I want to explain how deep that goes, because I think a lot of people are just like, oh, so I see somebody called a name and I'm a bystander. That's not so bad. You have to remember the officers that were not on George Floyd's neck were bystanders, and they got charged. That's how deep it goes. Don't be a bystander. The next step up, once you've gained a base level of awareness, this can be through readings, this can be through bothering your Black friends, however it works for you. You can get to allyship. Now, allyship is pivotal it is very much a talk the talk, but then walk the walk situation. Now, a lot of people talk the talk. I call this performative allyship. A lot of people do. And it means the occasional post. It means, yeah, I think Black people are cool. I support Black Lives Matter, making all of these claims, but then not putting any action behind it, not signing petitions, not having hard conversations, not educating yourself. If you're not doing those things, then you are an ally in name only, and that does nothing for us. Where you want to get to is what I call an action or ride or die ally, where you are as committed to this movement as the people of color who have to put their lives on the line every day, whether they wanted to be a part of it or not. Because as an ally, you get to carry your privilege everywhere with you. We have to carry our skin with us everywhere. So it means, yes.
Kyra, can you tell them what ride or die means?
Ride or die means if I am at the front lines of a protest and they're about to shoot a rubber bullet at me, a ride or die would step in front of me. That's ride or die. It means, first of all, you showed up with me. And second of all, you knew that you would face lighter consequences regardless of what I'm encountering, and you are willing to put yourself right in front of me to show that you stand with me truly, because I'm going to have to deal with it anyway. So ride or die means you are choosing to take this on because I didn't get a choice.
I love that definition. The key word is choice. So when I was in seminary in Berkeley, one of the things they taught us was that if you are a person of color, if you are female, if you are trans, if you are gay, if you are a lesbian, if you are anybody who physically should not be incarcerated, don't get in the front. Leave that space for allies who would ride or die, who can afford to go to jail, who won't be harassed because of either their sexual orientation or the color of their skin. And having those people with you in a movement, with you in a place where you're protesting is absolutely what fuels the protest. Because you have to have people who are willing to take the front line when it's not safe for other people to do that. I love your definition. I didn't mean to talk over you.
Well,
this is great. This is great for me, y'all. In the Black community, we very, very much value wisdom over everything. And I'm getting a lot of good wisdom right now.
So Josh, can you tell us a story or give us examples of white people who have done that?
Oh, sure. I come from the state of Michigan, and there's the very famous example of Viola Liuzzo, who was a housewife in Michigan, who saw the protests going on in Selma, Alabama, and she told her husband that she can't live in a country with that kind of racism and inequality. And she got in her car and she drove to Selma, Alabama, and she was murdered by the Klan during the Selma to Montgomery March. And so there are people who have done that. I think, what's really interesting about this moment is, a lot of folks often speculate, like, well, what would I do during the civil rights movement? Like, well, how would I react during the civil rights movement? Well, we're in that movement and we're in that moment now. So now you know. And so this is a moment really for us to become involved in the movement to push us towards a more inclusive democracy. And really, I'm humbled by Miranda and Kyra and Reverend Carroll, because what they're really talking about are the efforts that they are making every day to push us in that direction. And so, there's examples throughout history. There are examples today of people putting their lives and rioting and dying in the streets of DC, in the streets of Minneapolis. And we have protests here in Center County. We have protests in State College. There are marches that go on. And so this is the time for you to not just wonder what you would do, but to actually start to demonstrate what you are doing.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that a lot. And, I'm thinking about the protest that was last Sunday when Dr. Errol Henderson stood up, and I mean, he really brought it, and at the beginning, and throughout the women who organized, who were like calling on us and like just saying, show up, please show up, and go, not just today, come again and bring it into your life. Because what we need is our allies. It can't just be on Black people to be doing it all the time, because we can't. How are you going to do it? My wife and I just watched 13th again last night, and I implore everyone who on the call that if you have not seen the movie 13th, please watch the movie 13th. That is about the false promise of the 13th Amendment and the liberation of slaves, and we haven't done what we need to do.
This idea of being an ally and of showing up, the failure to do that is why we are sitting here tonight talking. The incident that happened with George Floyd, what struck me about it after I saw the tape a few times was two things. One was the number of policemen who were on his body holding him down. But the second one was the number of cameras that were on them, around them. So we got all these vantage points, these different views. There was a camera in the drugstore or the 7-Eleven on the corner. So we had like full frontal, full color. Nobody who was in the sea of witnesses around George Floyd stepped up and pushed a policeman off of him, simply was willing to get arrested for disturbing the peace or whatever that would have been called. Not a single person in that circle that was filming and observing and saying, get off him, you're killing him, felt empowered enough to push them off his neck. So that says something about us. That says something about us as a people and as a nation, the level of fear that we're carrying towards people who have sworn to protect and defend us. The idea that we're observers to the great tragedy of racism. That is what stayed with me after seeing those tapes over and over, is that there weren't allies. There wasn't a single person in that group who stood up for George.
Yeah.
And Yeah.
Josh, you called it a lynching the other day.
You know what? I mean, it is. I mean, that's what we've witnessed. And the thing that, you know, has also stayed with me, though, Reverend Carroll, I think you've brought up some excellent points, is George Floyd's not an aberration. You know, there was a study that came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago by a grassroots foundation that was titled Every 36 Hours. Mm-hmm. And what the report said was that every 36 hours in this country, a Black man, woman, or child is murdered or killed at the hands of a law enforcement agency or vigilantes, like happened in South Georgia a couple of weeks before George Floyd. And again, had we not had that video, I mean, we talk about systemic racism, we talk about the legacy of white supremacy. If we had not had that video of those white folks chasing down that Black man who was running through that neighborhood jogging, the prosecutor, the police, everyone who was involved in that case would have swept it under the rug. We would never have heard of it. There would have been no criminal charges brought about in that case. And so the question I think that keeps me up at night, and I'm sure others up at night, is how many George Floyds have occurred and we don't know? How many times has this happened in a community, in our community, or in a community next door, or a community down the road, and we don't know? And so part of what we need to be involved in, and again, I give the credit where the credit's due to Miranda and Kyra and Reverend Carroll, is, again, this is the moment to ask those questions. This is the moment to start to try to right those unrightable wrongs. And for the families of George Floyd and the families of the other people who have lost their lives, we will never make good on what happened to them, but we can try to do the best that we can by becoming involved and putting pressure on police, talking about disinvestment from police forces or defunding police forces or whatever we want to talk about. And this is the moment to have that conversation. This is our political moment to start to rethink what we do as a community, as a state, and as a nation.
Yeah, I want to say that there were some questions that were submitted beforehand that I think you all have answered, and so I just want to state those questions so that people know this is part of the listening. And for people who are watching right now, there is a question and answer box, and if you have a question that you would like us to take, please put it in there and we can try to answer it. And if we don't get to it, my campaign is committed to following up through email to answer those questions, whether it's from me or we can ask one of the panelists to follow up as well. And so some of those questions have been, how can I become actively engaged in my own community to start conversations about race? And as a white woman and mother, what's the best way I can help in this moment? So we've talked a lot about just starting the conversation is one thing, but then, you know, I want to ask, you know, Miranda, you're the youngest among us. So what would you say to this mother?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it starts at home. It starts in your household, you know, with your children. It starts with those conversations. I hear this a lot, that when you grow up as a Black child, you don't get to choose when you learn about racism because you experience it every day, right? So if you have a white child, if you are a white parent, those conversations need to start as soon as possible, especially because our school systems are so broken and corrupt and white supremacist. You have the obligation to do everything that you can do in your own home to make sure that your child understands their position in the world and their position in society. And I think that I see it here. People don't feel that obligation at all. It's really, really easy in this town to get away with just being an ignorant and uneducated white person. And we need to change that. We need to make it that you feel that obligation. And And, you know, you have so many resources available to you, so many books out there. Some, I just mentioned some earlier, but even, you know, there are even books for younger children. And I mean, I don't know everything, obviously, but I can tell you as a young person, the best thing for me when I was young was for someone to just talk to me. Don't gloss over it. Don't, you know, it doesn't need to be a pretty conversation. Just talk. Because when you put your child then into a school with other kids that maybe aren't having those conversations, it can cause a domino effect. And that's really important. So I would just say, like, it doesn't need to be something you're so concerned about. I think as long as you just talk about it, make an effort, don't shelter your child from it, and you can raise them to be an ally. You can 100%.
That's great. I know one of the things that I've been encountering is that, you know, for those of us who want to be allies, that you know, we're afraid. Of course we're afraid. We're afraid we're going to do something wrong. We're going to hurt somebody's feelings. We're afraid we're going to do totally the wrong thing, you know, that you're going to look stupid. But we got to be ready to kind of fail a little bit here, because we've been failing in totally the wrong way for too long. And so we have to muster it up and be ready to kind of show up. And I know that as a, you know, I'm a dad, you know, Josh is a dad, Reverend Carol is a mom, you know, you got to be ready to share that, I think, with your kids.
I'm a grandma. I'm the elder in the room.
That's right. You're the elder.
I'm the elder. That's right.
So we've invited and are really lucky to have a group of elected officials who've joined us, and they have submitted a lot of questions to us. And so I want to read some of those. So what policy changes do you think we could enact locally that would end racism here in State College? What specific actions or policies do you recommend be taken at the township, and I'll add the borough level? What actions will be implemented? Now that's an interesting question. Will be implemented to address denouncing racism, oppression, and police brutality against people of color? And I know, Kyra, you're going to be part of I guess you're an organizer of a rally on Sunday. And so, you know, I know that there are some specific demands that one of our local groups has. And so maybe we can just begin, you know, I give you the floor to talk about what those are, and then maybe we can talk about some others as well.
Yeah, so I will give you a disclaimer right now. Local policies, I am not an expert in at the moment, which is why I'm part of an organizing team, because teamwork makes the dream work. And you can't expect every person of color to be an expert on their local policy just because they're being oppressed by it. So I'm gonna say that. Given that, I can point you in the right direction. The 320 Coalition locally is doing amazing work. They just occupied our local municipal building today to meet with the mayor. They're about that life. So I recommend reaching out to established groups. We have not one, but two local chapters of the NAACP, one for the college and one for the community. So there are groups in place who dedicate their time, their manpower, their meetings to local policy research, to workable changes. And I guarantee that if not all of those groups, at least one of those groups have already answered all of these questions for you, and you've ignored those answers. So I will not be giving you those answers because I can guarantee that you've probably already heard them. But if you just needed me to name some groups that you could go to, there you go. Now, if you want to talk about actionable change, what can you implement? Take their advice, because they've done the research, they've figured it out. So you have to both hear it and do it. So that's my recommendation. And you have to do it fearlessly, because when it comes down to it, my life is not, whether my life matters or not, and whether I deserve to be treated like any other person in this community is not political. It's just basic human rights. And so don't get caught up in the politics of legislating for it. Now, I see somebody, I believe in the chat, giving you some more answers. So, I mean, again, it takes being open to hearing the answers to implement them. So reach out.
Yeah, and I'll note Janet Irons is a strong, very strong ally. Yep, and you can I think she's gonna start divvying some stuff out, and I encourage you to follow that chat and to learn more about our local coalitions. If you are a Penn State student or a Penn State faculty member or staff member, pay attention to what's happening with the Penn State Black Caucus right now. I think they have some really great leaders there. We have a question on the Q&A from Jesse Barlow here, who's on Borough Council. Thank you, Jesse, for being here. New York just repealed a law restricting access to police disciplinary records. Pennsylvania has a similar law. Would you favor its repeal? I want to say, just the other day, members of the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus occupied the floor of the General Assembly because a slate of bills that have to do with policing and police brutality and investigation had last year died in committee, in the Judiciary Committee, because the leadership, and I'll say the Republican leadership, and I don't want this to be partisan, it should not be partisan, but unfortunately we have a partisan poisoned legislature. The Republican leadership would not let it out of committee. So right now, up for vote are 4 bills, one of which would make it so that police can only use deadly force if necessary to prevent serious bodily harm or death to themselves or another individual. I don't see what's controversial about that. Another that would require the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate fatal incidents caused by a law enforcement officer. I don't see what's controversial about that. Another that would create a statewide law enforcement oversight board with the authority to certify and decertify law enforcement officers. I don't see what's difficult to accept about that. And another that would require law enforcement agencies, and this is, I believe, what Mr. Barlow is talking about, to keep detailed personnel records and submitted to the Office of Attorney General that include all criminal, civil, and ethics substantiated complaints, as well as the reason and circumstances surrounding the separation of each officer. And this is quite similar to one of the demands that's been made by the 320 Coalition, which is we want to know, people want to be able to know if an officer has a record that would indicate that they could be a threat to their community. And we know Mr. Chauvin, Officer Chauvin, who's no longer an officer, but is now, brought up on charges of second-degree murder against Mr. Floyd. He had a record. It's interesting. When I think about the era of the super predator, the talk about the super predator in the 1990s, and the talk about these kids who were just so awful, right? And they were victimized in their communities. I'm not saying that it is some outstanding number of cops, but it seems to me that there are these handful of super predator cops who are being protected by the government, and that they terrorize people in our communities, and that should not be allowed. Those people should not be on our police force. And that is not an accusation against the State College Police Force or any single police force. But, I'm a citizen. Kyra's a citizen. Miranda's a citizen. Reverend Carroll's a citizen. Josh is a citizen. Everyone here is a citizen. And the police are supposed to work for us. And they're to work for all people. And if they're not working for all people and they have a bad track record, if we can fire teachers, which I know can even be difficult, well, we need to be able to know about police officers.
I would even take it a step further and go on and dispel that few bad apples narrative. Let's just cut that out right there. The issue is in part, yes, the overt officers who are willing to commit the atrocities that they commit in front of a camera. But as much as we talk about the names that we are not aware of, those thousands and thousands of names that we are not aware died at the hands of police, that's a lot of bad apples, and that's a lot of bystanders that let that happen. If you sit by and watch a murder happen, you are charged. In most cases, obviously, our justice system is broken. You should be charged as an accessory. And so the way I like to look at it is you've got straight criminals and a lot of accessories getting overpaid to harass vulnerable communities. That is what we're dealing with. And I think there's a lot of pushback around that. Well, what are you going to do if somebody breaks into your house? What are you going to do if a crime happens to you? Frankly, I wouldn't call the police because that encounter could end with me dead. I could call the police because I am being attacked and end up being killed by the very people I called on for help. Do you realize how deep that goes? Could you imagine, especially for people who are related to police officers or in those really snug communities where you know their names? Could you imagine calling one of them in a crisis and they shoot you? It's hard to swallow. It's a hard pill to swallow. But for me, it's my reality. So I just want to be very clear. It's not a few bad apples. It's a broken system. And it's people with badges that are given power to legally harass vulnerable communities. So let's be clear on that.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Kyra. We have a question that I think we all knew would come. And I want to say, folks at home, typically these go till about 8. We have some good questions. And so I want to, if members of our panel wouldn't mind sticking around for a few minutes after, so that we can answer as many of these questions as we can. We have a question here about, defunding the police. And so I wonder, Josh, if I can throw this one to you to start, and then anyone else who wants to talk about what that means, because I think it has this name and people are like, oh my gosh, they jump to a lot of conclusions. Explain.
Yeah, so it's a complex issue, obviously, and there's a lot of different ways that people come at it. And so I'll talk a little bit about the way that I understand defund the police, and other folks can speak for themselves. Over time and currently, the police have been given a whole host of tasks, which arguably have nothing to do with law enforcement and have nothing to do with the protection of people's lives or even property. And so the example that I always give is, God forbid if I was to clutch my chest and fall over and you called 911 and I was having a heart attack, an ambulance would show up, the fire department would show up, I'd be taken to the hospital and be given medical care. If someone is having a manic episode or someone is having some other kind of psychological issue akin to, say, like a heart attack, and you call 911, the police show up with handcuffs and guns. And so part of what we need to think about when we talk about defund the police is ways we can send money to different community organizations or rethink how we intervene in people's lives in moments of crisis, which are life affirming, because the paramedics are trying to affirm my life by rendering first aid to me, getting me to the hospital while I'm having a heart attack, in other kinds of contexts where people are having some kind of crisis. And so part of what we need to think about, and part of what I would argue we need to rethink, is our relationship to a set of community institutions that are either underfunded or not funded or need to be created to be able to be part and parcel of our lives. To talk, and not to get too academic about this, but it's a difference between living in a country around negative peace and living in a country around positive peace. Negative peace is simply like the absence of some kind of war or overt violence. And so you can live in a country that's quote unquote peaceful, like the United States, and there's all kinds of violences that occur. We've talked a lot this evening about a lot of violences that are connected to histories of racism, white supremacy, and legacies of slavery that we've kind of got into. We need to shift focus to a positive peace approach in which you invest in institutions and in communities that promote peaceful and healthful engagements with one another, and peaceful and healthful organizations that affirm people's lives. And we don't do that. In fact, we cut those institutions, we cut those organizations, we cut those programs. They are the first things to be cut in a budget crisis. And we are living, most likely in the state of Pennsylvania, because of the COVID crisis, we will be living in the context of a budget crisis. We cannot have a political system which is going to disinvest at the moment we need it the most from institutions and organizations and programs that feed people, that provide mental health services, that provide pre-K education, that provide lunch programs for people to just kind of start. And so, you know, one of the things that I think, you know, we're obviously here for is that you're running to become part of the state government. The reality is we need people like you in the state government who will fight for the very programs that are about promoting community and promoting peace.
Well, absolutely. I would add to that, I agree with everything you just said, is people here defund the police, and they think you're saying eliminate the police. And that's not what the conversation is. If the police had less funding, say about the militarization of the police, we're overstocking on guns, we have small tanks now that are being used as police vehicles. We're using AK-47s, which basically are only meant to kill people. There's no other purpose for them. If we were reallocating the money that went to the police, so there wasn't so much being spent on those kind of things, and those funds went someplace else, that in essence is defunding and then reusing the money. I don't believe the police should be eliminated, but I do believe there are things that could be defunded and then those funds reallocated into a way that's community growing and that supports the kind of things that Josh was talking about.
There's a work out of Columbia Institute, Jeffrey Sachs, on the World Happiness Index. And I don't mean happiness like unicorns and bubblegum. I mean people living purposeful, meaningful, connected lives. And nations that have high levels of happiness have high levels of investment in public education, in health and healthcare, right? And things the equivalent of Social Security. And they also protect their natural environments. And they do all these things because they make people happy and healthy. They do not have excessive investment in militarized police forces, right? And
they invest in education on a broader plane. So more young children are able to go to pre-K school, pre through K school. So more are in daycare where there's education also offered to them. That happiness scale, they broaden where people are served.
And more food secure.
More food security.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of questions that, you know, I think we'll probably follow up with afterwards. You know, I'm really heartened by, you know, what you've brought to the table, each of you, because you've shown us some of how there's a lot of peaceful protesting right now, and there's a lot of awareness and there's a lot of interest, and you've each brought stories to the table. And so I guess the last thing is that, you know, Josh, you've raised some particular processes. You know, you talked about the truth and reconciliation processes a little bit. There are also ways that people right here, whether they're local government officials whether it happens at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, whether it happens, at State High, or, through the coalition of organizations that's organizing us right here in Center County, these different like ways of sitting down and just talking at a table. Can you share a couple of those with us?
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things that's been happening in the state of Mississippi through the William Winter Institute, which is associated with the University of Mississippi, and William Winter was the first non-segregationist governor in the state of Mississippi, is they have something called the listening table. And what they do is that it's a group of community facilitators. They go throughout the state of Mississippi, in particular communities that have these very real legacies of overt racial violence, both from the 1960s, but even from the current. And they get groups of concerned citizens, multiracial, multigender, some government officials, some local citizens, some religious figures, and they sit around a table. A lot of times they'll have maybe like some tea or whatever, sweet tea because it's the South. And they'll listen to each other and they'll talk and they'll say, this is my life experience. And in telling those stories and people listening, it creates a kind of start of a kind of community. And once you have that kind of process of listening, once you have that process of opening up, then you can start to take other steps in a community to address the real challenges and problems that people face. And there is not a community in the United States, State College and Happy Valley included, that doesn't have real problems that aren't affecting real people. And that's not a knock on the community itself, but that's the reality of life in America. Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to start to think about how to address that and start to work towards that, you first have to understand people's lives and the lives that they're living.
Yeah.
That's what the listening table is about.
Yeah, there are resources available for these kinds of talks that you can have. When we can not be so distant from one another, or maybe you can do it in a backyard with great big tables, or you can do it on a Zoom call, because I think that a lot of this has to do with being honest with yourself, right? We have to, Reverend Carroll, you started with truth, right? And part of that is telling the truth to ourselves. I remember New Year's Eve of going into 2001, I was standing in a crowd in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and there was a black man standing behind me. It was, we were about to, the equivalent of the ball dropping. I checked my pocket to make sure my wallet was there. And right now, part of me is like, appalled. That's 19 years later. But I remember that moment. And I remember the moment after I did it, there was a drunk white guy next to me who, that guy was going to might do something. This guy standing behind me, he's just a black man in the crowd with me. And I remember having this moment being like, oh, and it was a truth to me that inside this person who has thought of himself as a well-meaning, kind of ally, he had an entrenched, like a disease in his body. And when you have that, once you see that in yourself and you decide that that's something you need to be accountable for, and I'm no angel, I'm not here to say I'm an angel. Ask my son. You can't unsee that. Right? You can't unsee it. And so I think there's an element to the, finding the truth in yourself and then sharing that with others.
I want to touch on that a little bit because I think it can be a challenge to arrive at your truth when you've been blinded by privilege. And so I just want to give a couple quick tips on how to do that, the way that I have to do that. I think everybody should. So I mentioned this yesterday when we were talking, so I'll break it down much quicker because I know we're over time. But essentially, intersectionality is the big word, and I'll go from there. So you have to see yourself as more than just the color of your skin. Everybody has multiple identities which make them up. You have race, class, socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, ability, location, you name it. It's contributing to your lifestyle and your way of thinking. So what you need to do to arrive at your truth is you have to really sit with yourself before you even think about going to any listening table. You need to sit with yourself and ask yourself, why do I think the way I do? For you, it was, why did I react the way I did when that Black man was standing behind me? And the reason I say that you need to sit with yourself is because when you get people of color that are willing to come to the listening table, they're not coming to the listening table to hear, this is not to shame you, Peter, but it's not to hear stories like that. It's not, hey, I did this racist thing, but here I am listening. It's not to hear that. It's to hear, this has been my progress as an ally. Mm-hmm. This is a film I watched. Can we talk about this? Or I did this research. I Googled like you asked me to. I read this narrative. I want to talk about some of these points. That's what it means. And then you listen to those answers. But until you do the work with yourself, you're wasting the time of people of color who are willing to come into these spaces and help you out. So ask yourself, why do you react the way you do? Why do certain things make you uncomfortable? Why does defunding the police make you uncomfortable? Is it a personal experience? Is it community? What is privilege to you? What areas do you have privilege and what areas don't you? There's a lot to consider. So I think, as much as I love the concept of the listening table, I want to be very clear there are steps that come before it. And these are positive steps. They're hard steps, but they're positive steps. So don't let my tone dampen you, because I talk like this because I'm serious. But these really are positive steps. And the more willing you are to take them on, the quicker you get to the point where you are having positive conversations. And maybe some of that white guilt goes away. Just a little bit. I'm sure it's piling up for some of you. I'm not going to say I'm sorry, because this is my life. Yeah. But maybe some of that gets to go away when you're doing the right thing on a systematic level. Lawmakers. So, it's it's doing what you can with the power that you have, and with an understanding that's dynamic and changing and open.
I think one of the first things you talked about when you came on, Kyra, was wisdom. And I think that there was a lot of wisdom in those words, a lot of wisdom. I want to honor everyone's time, and, Josh, Miranda, Kyra, everyone who's been here, thank you so much. And Reverend Carroll, would you mind saying a few words to lead us out of our gathering here today?
I will say a few words. I want to invite you all to take a breath again, to start with the breath in and let that breath out. And put your feet on the floor, center yourself a little bit in the space that you're in. Source of sources, giver of life, divine one. Draw near to us. Lift us all towards the light. Magnify the whispering voices, the voices holding fear, the voices wanting to change. Magnify those voices and draw near to us. We all have the right to be here. We all deserve peace and freedom. Source of sources. Remind us all that we belong, and that in belonging and in building community, we can make a difference here. Amen. Asante. Blessed be.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who tuned in this evening. I really hope that you feel moved, that you feel like you understand something new, or that you have more conviction, and that you can do just as each of these folks have invited you to do, to make this into a real part of your life, so that we can make our community a better place to live. Thank you very much, and much love to you all.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us.